Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Building Subtxt. I'm your host Jim Hull. I love great stories and I built an application to help make more of them. Subtxt is an application I built based on over 30 years of narrative study, including my 2 decades in the animation industry as an animator and director for Disney and DreamWorks, my 7 years teaching story development at CalArts, and my practical experience helping develop projects ranging from animated television series to Canada's selection for Best International Film at the 2023 Oscars. Subtxt is a wonderful learning experience and a great place to develop your next story. As a recent subscriber told me, Subtxt has advanced my understanding of empiric story structure by an indescribable degree. I feel like I'm being mentored by a professor each time I sit to work on a new transit or the next through line. If you're ready to enjoy the same kind of mentorship our subscribers rave about, then Subtxt is the place for you. Discover more at subtxt.app. Today, I want to go over how to find the source of conflict in your main character throughline. If you haven't seen this video, Finding the Source of Conflict in Your Objective Story Throughline, you might want to check it out first, as it lays down all the foundational elements and concepts covered in this video. I will be using Poor Things, Oppenheimer, Past Lives, and American Fiction as examples. We'll be taking a look at each film's main character and defining where their unique source of conflict is for their personal throughline. So let's dive in. If you're familiar with Subtxt, you'll know that there are 4 throughline that make up a complete story. There's the Objective Story Throughline, the Main Character Throughline, the Obstacle Character Throughline, and the Relationship Story Throughline. And in a complete story, each throughline would focus on a unique area of conflict: universe, physics, psychology, or mind. As the Main Character Throughline is meant to portray the I perspective, these areas of conflict translate to how I'm stuck, what I do, how I think, and what I think. When it comes to the main character throughline, many conflate the idea of a protagonist with a main character. In Subtxt, the main character is not always the protagonist. Instead, the protagonist is seen as an objective function found in the Objective Story Throughline, primarily focused on the player pursuing the goal of the story. The main character throughline, on the other hand, is that up-close and personalized view of conflict that you find in a complete story. It represents what personal baggage the main character brings into the story, not necessarily what they're trying to do or what they're trying to accomplish. Sometimes these two appear in the same player. When that happens, you have a hero. But there are lots of stories where those two are split. And the reason why this is important is because there's plenty of times in our lives when we're not the ones in charge, and we're just kind of on the sidelines watching things happen. The Shawshank Redemption is a great example of this, where the protagonist of the story is Andy Dufresne, but the main character is Red. When writing a complete story, we need to identify that unique and intimate portrayal of conflict so that we, as the audience, can attach ourselves to the experience. We become a part of the story because we recognize what it feels like to deal with that kind of conflict all on our own. With Poor Things, you'll find that Bella Baxter has a main character throughline set in universe. And that's because she is defined by the fact that she has a baby brain inside of her head. That is a universe domain problem. You can even go so far as to say that the domain of the main character throughline defines who they are. Through Bella's eyes, we get to experience what it is like to journey from rebirth with that infant's mind to her struggle for autonomy in the outside world. The universe domain is frequently illustrated as a fish out of water, and for Bella, she definitely is a stranger in a strange land. Because all of us have had some sort of experience with what it feels like to be a stranger in a strange world, or to be perhaps not comfortable in our own body, or feel alienated from others because of our physicality. That's why we have the universe domain for exploring these kinds of issues in the main character throughline. With Oppenheimer, his main character throughline is less about his physicality and more about the activities he engages in physically. His drive to study the intricacies of the world around him and his effort to grapple with the profound ethical implications of his work places the source of conflict for him in the domain of physics. And as a sidebar, it's interesting to note that his study is that of the domain of physics. The line, "Can you hear the music, Robert?" is meant to communicate the experience of one struggling to rectify their awareness of the world around them with what they see and hear. Through Robert's journey, we get to experience what it feels like to hear that music and to accomplish all these great things, only to find out eventually that maybe we did too much. With Past Lives and Nora, it's less about her physicality and the things she engages in physically, and more about her attempt to grapple with the circumstances of her situation, showcasing what it's like to work through how you go about thinking about things like you would in a main character through-line domain of psychology. Throughout the story, she wrestles with thoughts of her former life and love that she left behind in Seoul, and compares that against her life in present-day New York. Her conflict is not about her physical isolation from Korea, as it would be in a story focused on a main character through-line and universe, but rather about her focus on figuring out who she is, who she's supposed to be with, and how she can reconcile her decisions given the course of her life. If you've seen the video about the Objective Story Throughline, you know that I mentioned the worst person in the world as an example of an Objective Story Throughline set in psychology. The worst person in the world, which is a similar exploration of life's choices found in past lives, differs in that its conflict of psychology exists on the surface and between all the characters found in that story. The dependencies and codependencies are a part of the conversation and a source of inequity for all involved. With Past Lives, the psychological struggle is contained all within Nora herself. The exploration is much more intimate and personal, an up-close look at those what-if scenarios that seek to define where one fits in and whether or not they made the right choice. Finally, we take a look at American fiction and its focus on a main character through-line set in the domain of mind. With Monk, the Jeffrey Wright character in the film, his source of conflict lies in what he thinks. He is completely obsessed with racist attitudes towards him and can't hide the disgust and contempt he feels in regards to where people are taking literature. But you'll note that it's his problem and his problem alone. His agent, along with everyone else, is perfectly fine with the state of the literary world. But for Monk, he can't believe that people are okay with what is going on. To him, this overt racism is a huge problem, as it so obviously reflects what others think of him. Monk has this ego and this arrogance that is there and that defines who he is in American fiction. He's not concerned with people looking at him and judging him by how he looks, as they do with Bella in Poor Things, and he's not struggling physically with the activity of doing his work like we see in Oppenheimer. Nor do we see him trying to figure out where he fits into all of this like we do with Nora in Past Lives. He really just has this bad attitude, and a lot of the comedy that plays out in the film stems from his refusal to reconsider his negative feelings and obstinate stance towards the fall of his beloved art form. As I mentioned in the previous video on the Objective Story Throughline, there's a question that you can ask yourself to make sure that you're identifying the right source of conflict for the different throughlines. And the question is this: if you think this is where the source of conflict in your main character throughline lies, ask yourself, if the properties of this domain were removed from the story, would this main character still have some sort of inequity? Would there still be a problem? And if the answer is yes, then you probably haven't correctly identified it yet. If the answer is no, then congratulations, you've successfully identified the source of conflict. For instance, Bella Baxter in Poor Things. If she didn't have a baby brain inside her head, then she wouldn't be experimenting with her body. She would just live her life, and everyone else would be trying to take advantage of her situation. That's why she's in the universe domain. For Oppenheimer, if he had just stopped doing all the things that he was doing in his study of physics, then he wouldn't have wound up where he did at the end. That great close-up shot of him where he contemplates his potential destruction of the world, if he hadn't been driven to engage in all those explorations, then there wouldn't be a story, and we would never have had that scene. With Past Lives, if Nora didn't really think through and come up with all these what-if scenarios and really try to piece together what does it mean that Sung is back in her life, what does it mean that she got married to Arthur, and how do all these things fit together? If she would just have some sort of certainty in her life and stop trying to figure out what all of it means, then you wouldn't have the beautiful film that is Past Lives. And lastly, with American fiction, if Monk just had a better attitude and he wasn't so obsessed with integrity and respect, then he wouldn't be the same character. That's why you want to try and find where the source of conflict is in your story? What is your main character throughline exploring? And the answer to that defines your main character and sets the personal experience for your audience. That's it for this exploration of finding the source of conflict in your main character throughline. Just one more thing. In all my years working with creative writers, I found that the main character throughline is the most difficult one for people to write. And this has everything to do with the fact that more often than not, the main character throughline is about the author themselves. The degree to which that throughline is represented successfully is an illustration of how honest and open and vulnerable the author can be. That's why the main character throughline is so important, because if the author doesn't care enough to bring themselves into the story, why should the audience care? If you have any questions about any of this, please leave them down below. Otherwise, I will see you next time.